So, good afternoon, guys. Welcome back to the first step towards the maxi thread on the Russian advance on Zaporozhye, which is not for the current, I'd say, timeline. The earliest that it could happen should be around July 2024, because a long range of prerequisites are to be acquired first. And first of all is the narrowing of the front line on the southern Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia front. How this is going to happen, why would it entail, what exactly is going to be the target for the Zaporizhzhia front. In my opinion, it would be the exact logic that Ukrainians were pursuing in the second phase of their own counter, which is pull down the front line on Zaporozhye of about 20 kilometers, which would allow them to bring the HIMARSs closer and start a attrition warfare against the rear lines of the Russian Federation, which would allow them by the end of 2024, 2023, early 2024, a more pervasive and complex attack towards the depth. So either Mariupol, either Bidmak, but the goal would have been reaching the Azov Sea, cutting the Russian forces in two, and starting to threaten both flanks. Very recently, so today I had a small discussion with a NAFO retard, pretty logical. Our dear friend Klinger66 has his own ideas. He judges the current operations of Robotyne stupid. I don't believe that. I currently think that he is retard, dead, and all his ilk have been wrong on this war since the beginning. I think our main difference is here, on top of the fact that he is a retard, come or boil down to the point that some people can see the Russians for what they are and can see the Russian actions based on what I'd say Eastern European would think logical or would think worth it. So basically, that's why I always say, if you want to fight a war against Russia or understand the war against Russia, you need to open a history book. And on that aspect, the material and human loss is far, 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 I'd say, eclipse what Western Europeans or Western countries could stomach. But the point is that for the Western countries in question, the war should be an exception. That's why, if you see logically, war is a cataclysm and probably the biggest, I'd say, structural failure for Western countries. And this, ironically, is very recent. War has been part of the Western countries forever. I mean, you can see Belgium, you can see France, you can see Italy. Italy, for a long while, was literally a tournament country. You had small bands of condottieri going left and right, waging local wars. Literally, it was football before football. But in that sense, for us Easterners, how we picture war, how we see war, what war entails, can be extremely complicated to understand for Westerners. In this case, I think the elements that were exposed towards me and him about but not only Robotyne, but also Avdiivka, literally show that they are still working with this principle of perfect operational art, which, as many people would say, is absurd. The Gulf War, Operation Desert Shield, and Desert Storm are almost perfect situations. You have a boxed enemy, you have no outside help, and basically the guys on the shooting alley. So you have superiority on everything: informational, tactical, strategical, and military. So at the end, it's pretty logical, pretty normal that whatever happens, even if the resistance is intense, interesting, and so on, the guys are going to lose. We are seeing the same thing happen in Gaza. Of course, Gaza is slightly different because on top of the enemy being boxed, the other side can use almost maximum violence. And the only recourse for the defendants is basically they are in an urban environment. So it creates this logic that Western forces, Israelis, whatever, can fight a war that Easterners cannot. This, of course, as I said, is a completely wrong and obviously short-sighted view on the whole war, especially now in Ukraine. Mostly because, as I was explaining to him, if you see the full pushes and the fact that the Russians were attacking the whole line, and you had attacks not only in Avdiivka, but you had attacks up trying to have Keramik, Novokalinove. Down you had people trying to get into Pervomaisk, and even lower there were attacks to Novomikhailovka. It was so extensive that Andrew Pedophile, even in the 16th of October, said that for him the core of the attack wasn't Avdiivka, but was Novomikhailovka. So when you realize this and you hear some moron saying that oh, it was an attempt to encircle the position, I'm like, with what? Yes, of course there were a lot of equipment used in the beginning, but where is the ongoing preparation? There were more bombs that fell in the latest phase of the Avdiivka op that literally were making resistance within the city impossible, to the point that somewhere around the 7th, Sirski probably gave the order to pull out with any means necessary. And these guys were still selling shit. I mean, the Korn group was selling shit up until the 7th of February. I even posted a small tweet by saying them, we're going to go into close quarter battle. Of course, they were not going to do that. It would have been even worse than Bahmut. But people who still maintain that the Avdiivka op, once again, was a failure because they failed to encircle these guys. Guys, that it doesn't work like that. It's the whole point of this war in Ukraine is that you have in front of you people whose information, people whose surveillance is on point. It's not just Ukraine. I'm gonna keep repeating this. These guys, most of the time, have better data than the Russians themselves. On Russian units, I'm sorry to say it like this. So, of course, at some point, the whole logic would be to just overrun the defense potential. It has nothing to do. If you want to even go back to operational art on the Soviet manual, what happened in Avdiivka was an attempt to overrun the lines and exploit the rear. And whatever was left in between that salient was supposed to be game. It never happened, and it never happened for multiple reasons. But the core task, which was to completely stretch them out and pull them out and make the attempt to resupply and reinforce the troops lengthier, more exposed, and thus more safe. It's exactly what happened. The first counter that the 47th attempted was an epic failure. You guys all remember that. They lost the Leopard. The Leopard is still there. They lost 4 Bradleys. They still are there. There is a reason. There is a reason why everybody coming to me saying, oh, it was an attempt to encircle. Encircle what? Where? Where from? If you want to encircle Avdiivka on the positions that were attempted to be taken, which was, I said once again, the heights around Stepove and then going down towards Berdishi, then for the core intent, it was completely achieved. Okay, far later, around November, where Ukrainians were forced to still battle the Russians around Stepove. And then they were literally forced to go through the Nas at Lastochkino. This situation was operationally a loss for the Ukrainians. Their stream of supplies was lower. Their attempted reinforcements would never make it because the Nas there was 4 kilometers. For once, you need to admit that whoever decided not to throw more shit into this shit show was right. Be that Syrskyi, be that Zaluzhny, never mind who did it, but they understood what was going to happen. Especially when they lost control of the south. Let me still remind you that Korn Group posted shit and copium for 2 weeks after the breach happened in the south. And let me remind you that a fuck ton of people were adamant that the south would have been cleared out. I had a talk with Andrew the pedophile once again, who said to me that, we have no evidence that the Russians hold Tsaskakotka, and they probably got beaten, and we see Ukrainians on the spot. Fast forward, now we know that not only it was a complete shit show, and that the Ukrainians' main weapon in Avdiivka has been their PR game, on top, of course, a stubborn defense of the approaches. But the reality is there. These guys knew that they had lost. And Butuzov said just the same in November. Of course, he had to cope. And it will always be the same. They will have to cope. They will have to do big PR moves. But with the war ongoing, it's going to be exactly the same way. It's going to be a slow loss. I compare this to salami tactics. The salami tactics mean that even though the Russians are expending a large force for all of these objectives, at the end, once you see the patchwork in the map, you end up understanding exactly what they're doing it. And therefore, we are going to go now to the prelude of the Zaporozhye operation. And actually, it's very simple. It is shrinking the front line. For people who have followed the war since the beginning, Russians have been seen themselves into a very delicate position, which is that they started an operation against a country of, back in the day, 37 million. That's what was given by the latest Ukrainian census. Over 600,000 square kilometers. And therefore, the second largest country in Europe at that time, officially, of course. So, including the areas that the Russians already had. This country was attacked with a force that everybody now is agreeing upon 200,000, 20,000 people. Everyone would tell you this was madness. When you compare the forces that were put together for Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm, you had almost a fucking million people. Of course, not everybody fought, and most of the battles were around the border between Kuwait and Iraq. And the operation, given that it had a UN mandate, was limited to, just liberate Iraq and, in a sense, demilitarize, liberate Kuwait and demilitarize Iraq. So the biggest problem with that approach, I'm going to come to the Iraqi example multiple times just to, dispel the myth that some can fight, some other can. It's completely different in the approach. And one of the main points is I said that Russia went to this war and failed to achieve multiple objectives since the beginning, but before even starting the war. One of these objectives, in my opinion, and everybody has agreed also about this, is that whatever was happening in Kiev, it wasn't supposed to be a, I'd say, conquest of the capital. Whatever people say, once again, you don't go after Kiev with 50, 60,000 unless you expect them not to fight, which, in my opinion, once again, was a complete lapse of judgment, if it really was like this. My opinion, once again, was that Kiev was a pressure point while the Russians were taking some very important real estate down south and threatening Kharkov. Down south for the sustainment of Crimea, and then threatening Kharkov for a pretty logical step, which everybody was talking about in the beginning, that Kharkov is a Russian city. Kharkov Oblast will applaud the Russians going in. But in reality, as we saw since the beginning, the Ukrainians, be that Kharkovites themselves or people that were pressed into Kharkov, opposed a resistance in every single matter. So from the beginning, you are going towards a country with a large potential, despite what everybody said, with a mobilizable force of at least 1 million people. With a fifth of that, granted, you have more armor, you have more asset, you have aviation, you have long-range fires, but the reality is that so even if that works, in the sense that even if you start gobbling this terrain, then what they start to do, you don't have the forces to pacify the rear, you don't have the forces to stabilize the battle lines. You will start to dig in continuously, which is not what the Russians wanted, and obviously that's why a lot of the early losses, I can post you a whole company of Tunguska's air defense just lined up, abandoned there for whatever, lack of fuel, broken down. The guys fled because the Ukrainians were coming, and torched. We had this multiple times. We had logistical failures. We had command and control failures. Every single aspect of the operation initially made no sense given the tasks at hand. So you're going with 200,000 people against a force that clearly was mobilized, a force that was counting on the Russians advancing as fast as possible, and also a force that had chosen its, ground to stand. So Kiev was one, Deep Kharkov was another, and they wanted absolutely not to lose Nikolaev, because, as I said, once Nikolaev is lost, Odessa is just a month, 2, 3, 4, 6 months away from losing its actual, logic reason to be. And then there was the Snake Island control, which, stopped almost any kind of advance through the sea, and, of course, the import and export of goods from Ukraine. Now, once we go there and once we analyze it, and the Russians have to make this mea culpa, and probably for Putin, this is the biggest thorn of this war, then you know that you absolutely failed. The failure was in the planning, the failure was into the hubris, the failure was into the thinking that you would avoid a long war. So of course it's going to be a failure. Your enemy has open borders, it has one of the most powerful military alliances, telling them, guys, you're going to fight, we're going to help you out. You fail to envision this whole at war, and then you leave critical installations and spots completely undamaged until at least April. So the first 3 to 4 weeks is whatever happened is on the Russians. And their hubris, their conception of warfare, but at the same time, what happens after, it's also on the Russians. So the fact that they turned this war into this historical carnage is also how they have done this through their history and how the Easterners have done this through our history. So hearing people explaining to me that, oh, it was supposed to be an envelopment and a cauldron, while I'm like, how are you going to support this cauldron? Where to? If you already have a problem to breach through because there's FPVs and shit everywhere, how are you going to support this cauldron with at least 20, 30 tanks that should advance with at least 60 trucks that are completely undefended against anything? And with your defenses being literally on a depression, and on the other side, you got the guys on the ridge. So that's what I said. I'm going to repeat it. This was a operational attempt to completely slide away the Ukrainian defenses. It took a lot of losses, but it worked within the week 1 and 3 of the operation Avdiivka. And for Robotyne, they're going through the same motions. So what's going on with Robotyne? Right now, the attack has reached the limits, the outskirts of the city. One group of Russians was captured within the city, but literally the first house inside. And this spells, in my opinion, doom. When it comes to how this battle went for the Russians during the summer 2023, until the Ukrainians were 1, 2, 3 kilometers from the small hamlet, it was a problem. The Ukrainians could not face, the battle for as long as it was contactless. Once they got within the premises, within 800 meters, the city fell within a week. I'm not saying the Russians are going to do the same, but given how fast it went and where they came from, because they came from west to east towards Robotyne, we can expect that within 1 or 2 weeks, the situation is solved, be that by Ukrainians leaving the ruins of the city or simply the Russians taking over. Once again, the biggest problem is, and I already posted the images of the issue with Robotyne, is that once they got the hamlet around later August 2023, they had already started pushing eastwards towards Verbovo and Novopolkovka. Why? Because they needed that extension of the, let's call it beachhead salient, whatever you want, in order for both of them to create a wide gap enough into the defenses. So they succeeded to have a breach or infiltration, call it as you wish, of about 800 meters within the first line that ended into the ditch, and the advance was slowed south of Verbove and completely killed. And once you have this, you would say, okay, the Ukrainians spent the whole summer, it amounted to basically nothing, and you would think they would just, pull back because they are in this salient. And it's true that during November and December, they tried another push towards Kopani in order to widen it. And this is exactly what I'm saying, that why would you try to widen salient that if you are not willing to support, sustain, and exploit it later? We always know what it was. We can call it either Zugzwang for the Ukrainians, in the sense that they did all this, and due to the sunken cost fallacy, they're going to stick with it. Or we can do something different and, try and comprehend this in a completely different way, which is the Ukrainians, of course, they want to exploit it later, but given that they hit the heart on Verbovoe, they're pushing towards Kopani. In both cases, the common wording for this is exploiting the Robotyne satellite. The Robotyne satellite has two advantages. First of all, it's connected to the highway network behind it, from Orikhiv to Pologi and so on. Second of it, it's not very far from Zaporozhye, honestly. On a straight line, it's about 26 to 30 kilometers, but there is a highway network which allows maybe not Zaporozhye to be the direct logistical line towards Orikhiv, but still it allows a good enough connection. In many ways, Zaporozhye serves to Orikhiv as Pokrovsk serves to Konstantinovka for the moment. Of course, both of them are not in the same environment. Orikhiv is far smaller, has been continuously treated by the Russians, and therefore presents a lesser value in absolute terms. So sustaining their counter would come after, in my opinion, a lot more preparation of the Ukrainian side. So on that aspect, there is a logic of, I'd say, confusion. And it's true that if you analyze it to the summer counteroffensive lens, Klinger is not wrong. Like, they already got beaten the shit out 2023. Why do they do the same 2024? Well, first of all, we never said Pigers had any kind of logic when it comes to this warfare, and I already explained it, that why Kherson and Kharkov might look at absolutely master strokes, and they are in their own merit. The problem is that they killed the strategic balance because they were, in a sense, maybe not low-hanging fruits. Kherson was, but Kharkov was a bit more complex. Although once you analyze the whole layers behind it, you would understand that Kharkov actually was pretty nasty for the Russians, because the Russians were like, the front's still going to be there whenever we want, which is what's going on right now with a couple of bombardments from Russia. And at the end, we can always be back to Kharkov. So in a sense, while they couldn't stop the advance, they coped differently by saying that in the end, it doesn't matter for us. And it's true. When you see where they're fighting right now, for the Russians, indeed, all the conditions are there. Either decide to, build up a new formation and go for Kharkov, to actually do just that, which is basically come back and transform this war into something very compact, what they want to do right now in order to spare troops and spare assets, into something wider, which would, in my opinion, cause huge problems for the Russians, but would also probably break the Ukrainians, given the extent of the defense they need to restart mounting up north. So in that sense, the biggest problem for, I'd say, Robotyne and the Ukrainians here is not that they are stupid or not. They are, I'd say, in part stupid, but on the other side, what are their options? They killed, I'd say, the easy ones with Kherson, which are now blocked by the Dnipro itself. The Kharkov area, they killed it as well, because if you want to be absolutely logical, trying to fight in Kharkov how the Ukrainians are doing right now is doing it wrong, because the Russians have a lot more logistical capability up north than they have down south. So once you eliminate these 2 points, what remains? Southern Ukraine. And on top of it, it's a strategic goal once again, because you can cut the Russian forces in two and make Crimea a lot more complicated to supply and to sustain for the Russians. And even if that happens, of course, the operation to quote-unquote take back Crimea for Ukrainians would take probably 2 or 3 years to prepare. And this, of course, as I said, is completely problematic, because I don't think the Ukrainians had 2 or 3 years in preparations without getting absolutely smacked. However, let's go back to what we were saying. Why Robotyne? It's very simple. What are the other options down south? One of them is to do something extremely stupid, which is a D-Day around Zalizny port or literally into Crimea. This is science fiction. This is what the Sun or Daily Mail spoke about at some point. It remains science fiction, and it would require a force that, first of all, the Ukrainians would need to navalize, and that would be at least 40 to 60,000 people. And then on top of that force that needs to navalize, it would require a second force that would have to come and exploit this attempted D-Day from the northern approach from Zaporozhye. So again, you would need Robotyne. Once you eliminate this logic of bypassing by boats, you go to the other problem. The other problem is trying to cross the Energodar channel or reservoir. There again, you will have a stretch of between 11 and 20 kilometers, depending on where you want to go. The stretch now is rather dry. There is still a small stream. And the other problem, as I said, with this is that you need to accumulate a lot of equipment in multiple points around the Energodar reservoir, which first of all is not going to get seen, but second of all would need to perfectly cooperate. And they had a huge problem from starting point to 5 kilometers in Robotyne. In hard ground, dry land, full summer. Now imagine doing that in soft ground, whenever I'd say period they would choose for it, through 20 kilometers, even 11. And as I usually said, the biggest problem is that once you're going to lose your Leopard, your Abrams, your T-64, T-80, whatever you fucking want to use, that thing's going to start sinking. So you're going to literally have choke points that you're going to create yourself with your lost vehicles. And once again, the biggest problem is that nobody is thinking straight on the Ukrainian side. So I would even fucking bet on at least one or two attempts with very light forces, 50, 60, 100, 200 people trying to establish, small beachheads on the other side, which once again will come to what Klinger said, infiltration. It's retarded, but Ukrainians are doing it in Krinky right now. Although in Krinky, as I said, it is mostly because it's a short way. You have only 600 to 1 kilometer to cross by boat. And also you have this defense in front of you with these marshy islands, which make it almost impossible for the Russians to do anything. And those marshy islands can be used to put repeaters and whatever you want. The biggest problem, though, when we analyze the Ukrainian choices, as I said, there is nothing else. Or you're going to try South Donbass, South Donetsk, but you're going to have a problem there because what is happening right now is what the Russians have been trying to do for a long time, which is bringing the front line to the 532, so Ugledar-Kurakovo, and that's an advance laterally from east to west, about, as I said, 20 kilometers. Once they're there, the second step would be to go from the Ugledar area another almost 40 kilometers towards Velika Novosirka and the advance down south. These two steps are going to take a lot of time. But these two steps are going to make it impossible for Ukrainians to be able to have this wide 170, 180 kilometers front that they had in 2023. If everything goes fine, the front goes from 180 to 155, more or less, in Ugledar, and if the rest is pushed, the front in length would go to 118, 115 kilometers. So the maximum Russian position I'm seeing east to west towards the banks of the Dnipro at the Energodar reservoir. So, what is that we are expecting on the Russian side? As I said, the prelude is shrinking the battlefield, shrinking the contact line, making sure that the advances are contiguous and persistent, so we don't have the problems that they had with Ugledar early 2023. There was an attempt and then it simply stopped it and pursued the advance in Donetsk. This is what they're doing right now, which is an attack all over the line. And interestingly enough, this is exactly also where we want them to go, which is shrinking that front line down south and pushing also the line up north and in center Donetsk. So, biggest problem for Ukrainians right now is how to deal with the fact that the Russians are hoping left and right. So right now they are deciding to go first through central Donetsk, just next to it to Avdiivka. There is the push in Mikhailovka. There was a push in Pobeda. There was still the push ongoing from Solodkoye towards the highway Ugledar-Kurakovo. And of course there's a push up north and around Bahmut. If all these pushes culminate to where I think they were going to go, or at least they should be going, there we are reaching one main factor of the Ukrainians being forced to actually counterattack somewhere. Because if everything goes like this, and the lines are shrinking, for instance, if the Russians reach Kupiansk and completely reformulate the Oskil defense line, then they can control the defensive point on the front over there. It would mean that for a later date, when the Ukrainians would like to recover their territory, the counterattack there is going to be a lot more complicated. So all this, in a sense, serve the purpose of pushing the Ukrainians back, shrinking the front lines, and this maximizing the Russian, I'd say, advantages in firepower. We already went through this. It's literally the baseline management, fire baseline management, which is you need to have as much of a backfield as possible. And of course, Ukraine has a better backfield in absolute terms, if you just look at the map. But then you need to go through the roads they control, and that's where the danger is for the Ukrainians if the Russians manage somehow to come close enough to Pokrovsk and come close enough to Porogi and Orikhiv. Because once that network of road over there is done with, Ukrainians will have a huge gap behind that line. I'm going to post maps, so you're going to see it. The whole game right now is to push the Ukrainians into using as much dirt roads as possible in order for them to reduce the efficiency of their logistical control. We saw this in Avdiivka. Once the main allies were threatened or cut, they just folded. And they didn't fold because they wanted to. They folded because the logic was forcing to open a road network would just mean a lot more losses, and we saw that any kind of counter in Avdiivka was literally useless. They pushed from, they lost vehicles, they went back. Of course, the Russians lost equipment, and I explained one of the positive points with the Avdiivka loss is that the Russians may start to check which vehicles are still usable, which not. And I said, given to what I'm seeing, if they can manage to salvage 20% of what was lost there, out of what they can take from the Ukrainians, all the best. It's still a force regeneration ratio far more than what the Ukrainians can throw at them for the moment. How long they can keep this is something different, but it's just the same thing when it comes to the rear network. So, what is the problem? First of all, you have to open your Google Maps and see the problem with Robotyne. Robotyne has a warchief on the back and has a double threaded highway network behind it. This links it straight to Zaporozhye. Pushing to Robotyne, colmating that salient there, first of all, gives them back a lot of, I'd say, strategic space to lose in any kind of future counter by the Ukrainians. Second of it, it starts to put the Russians back to threaten Orikhiv. Orikhiv is not the same city it was in 2022, 2023. It has been extensively bombed, and for the Ukrainians themselves, given they had also to play musical chairs with Donetsk and Zaporozhye, the staging point of Orikhiv is now in a completely different approach. It's, I'd say, even gone. So once the Russians start pressuring this area and put themselves there with Orikhiv, near to it or taking over the city, then once again the Ukrainian forces defending the area would have to put themselves along the highways that go from Zaporozhye down south or Zaporozhye east and then south. This is going to make the defense of the approaches to Zaporozhye much more complicated for the Ukrainians, although, as you may have seen through the visualization that Clement has done, thank you very much, although he's not pro-Russian, at least we can use his tools to look through that lens as well. The Ukrainians right there have only one line of defense, which is literally just behind Orikhiv. If Orikhiv falls and you take that line of defense, then Zaporozhye is not open. I'm not saying it's an easy gain, but the position of Zaporozhye as a logistical hub and staging point is going to become far more complex. As I said, while the Zaporozhye down south is a very defensible position, Zaporozhye towards the east becomes a far more problematic proposition for everyone. So basically, Robotyne right now is a preparation, first of all, for self-defense action towards later in the year, but also a stepping stone towards Orikhiv within 6 to 8 months. But it would require, as I said, first of all, that the front comes at least at the 0532 Ugledar-Kurakovo, and that's not yet in the cards. This was the prelude. Thank you very much, guys. I will not be taking questions because I said I'm going to make a way better thread on it on Thursday, because here it was a bit more of a rant. So, sorry, guys. We will see each other on Thursday. Thank you.